She didn't want love. He didn't believe in family. And the boy? He stopped hoping a long time ago. But fate doesn't knock. It kicks the door open. What started as a marriage of convenience soon turned into a war against the past. One scar, one secret, one snowstorm at a time. And just when they thought peace had settled in, someone from the boy's former life lit a fire none of them were ready for. If you've ever believed that love can grow in broken places, this story is for you. The schoolhouse was colder than usual that morning. Frost crawled across the inside of the windows like lace, and the old iron stove coughed and rattled as it struggled to fight off the chill. Still, the children filed in one by one, boots wet, noses red, breath fogging in front of their faces. But one desk sat empty, second row from the window. That's where Henry Whitlow always sat, usually hunched forward like he hoped no one would notice he was there. He wasn't loud. He didn't cause trouble, but he showed up. Rain, wind, even that blizzard last winter. He had come. Eliza Ward noticed the absence immediately. Her chalk paused mid-word on the blackboard. She turned slowly, eyes drifting over the room, then landing on the vacant chair. "Has anyone seen Henry this morning?" she asked. The room fell quiet. Jacob Miller, a boy with a cowlick that refused to behave, raised his hand hesitantly. "He didn't walk with us today, ma'am. Said he might not be coming back." Eliza lowered the chalk. "Why would he say that?" Jacob shifted in his seat. "He had a bruise on his jaw yesterday, bigger than usual. Said his pa was drinking again. Said he might just run off for good." A hush fell over the class. Several of the children glanced at one another, but said nothing. Eliza's mouth went dry. It wasn't the first time Henry had shown up with bruises. She had asked gently, even paid a visit to the Whitlow home once. But the father was a cold man, and the house always stank of sour whiskey. Still, she had hoped her presence made some small difference. Now that desk sat empty. The bell rang, but she barely heard it. Lessons blurred past. Letters, numbers, recitation. None of it stuck. Her eyes kept drifting to that space in the second row. By noon, she dismissed the class early, told them it was because of the cold. As the children pulled on mittens and scarves, little Lucy Dobbins tugged at Eliza's sleeve. "Miss Ward?" she asked, eyes wide beneath her knitted hat. "What happens to Rusty if Henry don't come back?" Eliza blinked. "Rusty? His dog." The word struck her harder than expected. She placed a hand gently on Lucy's shoulder. "We'll figure it out, sweetheart." When they were gone, she stood alone in the still, quiet room. Then she moved. The house sat at the edge of a cedar rise. Snow gathered like frosting on its pitched roof. Smoke curled from the chimney. Thomas Ward was sitting at the table when she walked in, knife in one hand, whetstone in the other, the steady rasp of metal on stone filling the space. "Eliza?" he said, surprised. "Everything all right?" "No," she answered firmly, pulling off her gloves. "One of my students is missing, Henry Whitlow. He hasn't come to school, and one of the boys said he's run off, that his father was drinking again." Thomas set the knife down. "Henry, the quiet boy." She nodded. "I need your help," she said. "I think he ran toward the woods." Thomas stood, reached for his coat and rifle. "You're sure?" She looked up at him. "I'm not sure of anything, except that if something happens to that boy while I sit on my hands, I'll never forgive myself." He grabbed his hat, pulled it down low. "Let's go." They reached the Whitlow place near dusk. It was a crooked house with flaking paint and a porch that sagged in the middle. No light in the windows, no smoke in the chimney. Thomas knocked. No answer. He opened the door. Inside smelled like sweat and cheap liquor. A chair was overturned. An empty bottle lay near the hearth, long gone cold. Eliza stepped forward, careful of the broken glass. "Henry?" she called. Silence. Her eyes fell on a piece of paper on the kitchen table, weighted down with a stone. She picked it up and read the scrawled message. "I ain't going back. I don't want to be his boy no more. I'm sorry, Miss Ward. Tell Rusty I'm sorry too." Eliza closed her eyes, the paper trembling in her hands. Thomas touched her elbow. "Tracks outside, kid-sized, headed east." "You can tell that just by looking?" she asked. He didn't answer, just stepped out the door, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the snow. She followed. They followed the trail past the creek bed and into the dense pines. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long. Eliza's legs ached, but she didn't stop. After an hour, Thomas raised a hand. There, ahead, beneath a rock overhang and thick evergreens, was a crude shelter, old branches lashed together and dusted with snow. They approached slowly. Inside were crumbs of bread, a tin cup, a ragged blanket, and a small, torn mitten. But no Henry. Eliza stepped forward. He was here. Thomas pointed to a second set of footprints, larger, heavier, deeper. Someone else was, too, not long ago. Her heart pounded. You think someone took him? I think someone found him, Thomas said quietly. And I don't think it was his dog. Eliza turned toward the forest, heart in her throat, cold crawling up her spine. Somewhere out there, a child was alone. Or worse, not. And if the world still made any kind of sense at all, she wasn't going to let that desk stay empty. The wind picked up as night fell deeper over the forest. Snowflakes swirled in the beam of Thomas's lantern like pale moths, landing on Eliza's shawl and melting instantly. She tugged the wool tighter around her shoulders, but it did little good. The cold wasn't just from the weather. It was from the gnawing thought that somewhere out here, a boy was scared, freezing, and not alone. Thomas crouched at the edge of the lean-to, running his fingers lightly along the snow. They headed northeast, he murmured. Footsteps are deeper, dragging a bit. He's tired. Are they walking side by side? Eliza asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He shook his head. Number 1 set's leading. Henry's following. And not willingly, if I had to guess. Eliza swallowed. You think whoever found him meant harm? I think, Thomas said, standing, we don't have the luxury of hoping otherwise. They pressed forward through the trees. The pine canopy above was thick, blotting out the stars, and the undergrowth was just enough to make every step slow. Eliza stumbled more than once, but Thomas always caught her, steady and silent. He ran because of fear, she said after a long silence. But he didn't run far. He still wanted to be found. Thomas nodded. Kids don't run to disappear. They run because no one's coming to get them. Eliza blinked at the truth of that. She thought of her own childhood, of being left behind again and again by adults who promised they'd show up. Maybe that's why Henry's desk hit her so hard. She had been that empty seat once, too. They reached a narrow ravine, and Thomas paused, holding the lantern high. The trail was clearer here. Fresh snow hadn't fallen in the past hour, and the tracks looked sharp, recent. There, he said, pointing to a ridgeline. Small cabin, maybe a trapper's place. Eliza squinted. At first it looked like a rock outcropping, but then she saw the faint glimmer of lamplight from inside. Her heart caught. Could he be in there? She asked. Thomas didn't answer. He just stepped ahead, lowering the lantern and raising his rifle. Stay behind me. They approached slowly, their boots crunching softly in the snow. As they got closer, the light inside flickered. Movement. A figure passed by the window. Then a sound. A short, sharp bark. Eliza nearly cried. Rusty! Thomas's grip on the rifle didn't loosen. Dog's alive. That's good. But let's see who's feeding him. They reached the porch. It sagged under their weight. The door was partly ajar. Thomas moved to one side of the frame. Henry, he called. Silence, then a small voice from inside. Miss Ward? Eliza didn't wait. She pushed the door open. Inside, Henry sat on the floor, curled in the corner of the cabin beside his dog. His clothes were wet, his lips cracked, and his eyes hollow. But he was alive. Eliza rushed to him. Sweetheart, are you hurt? He shook his head, but when she touched his arm, he flinched. She looked down. His wrist was swollen, bruised. Rusty whined and licked her hand. Thomas entered behind her, lowering the rifle. Henry, Eliza whispered, who brought you here? The boy hesitated. Then his eyes shifted to the shadows near the hearth. Eliza followed his gaze, and finally noticed the second figure. A man slumped in a chair, fast asleep or unconscious. His coat was patched, his boots worn. A bottle hung loosely in one hand. Beside him, a sack sat half open, dried meat, a few coins, and a small revolver. Thomas stepped forward, cautious. Recognize him? Eliza asked. Thomas nodded grimly. Jed Harper used to run whiskey across the river, got caught up in a kidnapping years back, was never charged. Disappeared 2 winters ago. Eliza's blood turned to ice. He took Henry? Henry nodded. Said my pa owed him money. Said I was worth something. Thomas exhaled through his nose, jaw tight. We need to get out, now. He crossed the room, grabbed the bottle from Jed's hand and tossed it into the fireplace. The crash jolted the man awake. He blinked, groggy and confused, until he saw Thomas. You, he slurred. Thomas raised the rifle. Don't. Jed blinked at the muzzle. You don't got the guts, Ward. You're still just a soldier boy who couldn't save nobody. Thomas stepped forward, silent. Jed sneered. Boy's mine now. Debt's a debt. Then Thomas spoke, his voice low and cold. You lay a hand on this child again, I'll make sure your next bed's in the ground. Jed's mouth twitched, but he didn't move. Thomas turned to Eliza. Get Henry wrapped up. We leave now. They didn't speak much on the way back. Henry rode in the back of the wagon under thick quilts, with Rusty curled at his side. Eliza kept a hand on his shoulder the whole time, even as the wind bit at her cheeks and snow gathered in her lashes. When they reached the edge of town, dawn was just breaking. Thomas helped Eliza carry Henry inside. The stove was already burning from when they left, but Eliza piled on more wood. She brought water, wrapped Henry's arm in a cool cloth, and fixed him a plate of eggs and bread. He only picked at it, but he stayed awake. Eliza crouched in front of him. You're safe now. Do you hear me? He nodded slowly. I'm sorry, she said, voice trembling. I should have known. I should have done more. Henry looked up at her, and for the first time his voice didn't shake. You came. 3 words. That's all. But they cracked something open in her chest. She touched his cheek, then turned as Thomas entered with a fresh blanket. He knelt beside the boy, adjusting the sling he'd fashioned for the injured wrist. You're staying here, Henry, Thomas said, until we figure out what comes next. The boy looked between them, cautious hope flickering in his eyes. You sure? Thomas nodded. I don't make promises I won't keep. Eliza met his gaze. Neither did she. The snow fell in lazy spirals outside the parlor window, muffling the world in a hush that felt too peaceful for the ache inside Eliza's chest. She stood in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, watching Henry sleep on the settee. Rusty lay curled at his feet, his shaggy head rising and falling with every breath. Henry hadn't said much since they'd brought him home. He'd eaten a little, drunk the broth she ladled with trembling hands. Let her clean the scrapes on his cheek without a word. But it was his silence that spoke loudest. Some bruises didn't show on skin. She turned when Thomas stepped through the front door, shaking snow from his coat. His rifle was slung over one shoulder, and in his free hand, he held a thick letter wrapped in twine. Sheriff's office wired the circuit judge in Abilene, he said. Told him everything about Harper and the boy. He'll send someone. Do you think they'll believe us? Eliza asked quietly. Thomas laid the letter on the table. There's Henry's bruises, the lean-to, Harper's tracks, his cabin, the boy's testimony. Eliza glanced toward the sleeping child, assuming he ever wants to talk again. Thomas stepped forward, brushing the edge of her hand with his own. You got him out. You did that. I didn't do it alone, she replied softly. Thomas didn't answer. He never said much when praise came his way, but the look in his eyes, that quiet, storm-weathered certainty, was something Eliza had learned to lean on. Later that afternoon, she sat by Henry's side reading from a worn storybook. She didn't know if he was listening, but she read anyway. About a boy who followed a stream into a strange land, where the trees whispered and shadows held secrets. And when the boy in the book said he wasn't afraid, Henry stirred. Everybody's afraid, he whispered. Eliza closed the book, laid it on her lap. Yes, sweetheart, they are. He didn't look at her, just stared at the fire. My pa used to say I was weak when I cried, that I was soft. But sometimes when he drank too much, he cried too. I saw him. Eliza felt the tears start to rise but swallowed them back. That wasn't your weakness, Henry. That was his. Henry's voice was smaller now. He said, I reminded him of my ma, that she left because of me. Eliza reached out and took his hand. Your mother left because she couldn't live with that kind of pain anymore. It had nothing to do with you. He didn't answer, but his fingers tightened ever so slightly around hers. That night, Thomas found her sitting by the fire, her arms wrapped around her knees. You all right? He asked. I keep thinking, she said, not looking up. What if Harper hadn't fallen asleep? What if we'd gotten there 10 minutes later? What if... Eliza, she looked at him. You're not going to save every child in this world, but you saved this one. She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her sleeve. Thomas hesitated, then sat beside her. For a long moment, they just listened to the crackle of the fire. Then quietly he said, I was Henry's age when my father left. My ma worked herself near to death trying to keep the house. Some nights when she thought I was asleep, she'd sit in the dark with an empty bottle and talk to no one. Eliza turned her head. She wasn't a drinker, he said, but she kept that bottle. Not for drinking, just to hold. Something solid, something to grip when everything else was falling apart. Eliza whispered. What happened to her? She died when I was 16, pneumonia. Sheriff said he'd try to send me east to some cousin. I ran instead, lied about my age and joined up. He let the words settle. I never got to say goodbye. Eliza's hand drifted toward his, their fingers brushing gently. She'd be proud, Eliza said, of the man you became. Thomas looked down. She wouldn't recognize him. I barely do. Eliza squeezed his hand. I do. The silence after that was warmer. A week passed. Henry grew stronger. His appetite returned, and so did his voice. Soft at first, then louder as Rusty chased chickens in the yard, and Eliza scolded both of them, half laughing. But the boy never once asked when he had to go back, and neither Eliza nor Thomas brought it up. Until one morning a knock came at the door. A man in a long wool coat stood on the porch, clean-shaven, neatly dressed, eyes too sharp to be kind. Eliza Ward? He asked. She stepped forward. Yes? My name's Samuel Brooks. I'm with the Territorial Child Services Office. I was sent from Abilene regarding a minor in your care. Eliza's heart dropped. Thomas appeared beside her, a protective wall of quiet strength. Brooks smiled tightly. We'll need to talk about custody, about arrangements, and about what comes next. Eliza's fingers curled into fists because she knew what this man saw when he looked at Henry. A case file, a misplaced child, a burden. But he was wrong. Henry Whitlow had a home now, and Eliza Ward wasn't about to let anyone take that away. The kettle shrieked just as Eliza's patience snapped. Samuel Brooks had been speaking for 15 uninterrupted minutes, and every word out of his mouth made her fingers twitch. He sat primly at the kitchen table, not touching the tea she'd poured, tapping a pen against a thick leather-bound folder labeled State Custodial Action, H. Whitlow. Thomas stood behind her, arms crossed, face unreadable. I understand your attachment to the boy, Brooks said, flipping a page. But this isn't personal. The law is clear. Henry is a minor with no legal guardian. His father is, by all accounts, unfit, and his mother is deceased. That places him under the jurisdiction of the state. Eliza folded her arms. So the state's plan is to take him from the only people who've kept him safe? Brooks sighed as if she were a stubborn student. We have protocols, Mrs. Ward. Miss, he paused. Miss, then. Regardless, we have licensed facilities better equipped to... Thomas stepped forward. You mean an orphanage? Brooks looked up, blinking behind his glasses. It's a temporary placement. Like hell it is, Thomas said, voice low and firm. I've seen boys disappear into those places and come out angry or empty. Or not at all. Eliza held up a hand, silencing him. Her voice was calm, measured. You said his father's unfit, that he has no family. Then what he needs now isn't a system. It's stability. It's people who've proven they'll bleed before they break his trust again. Brooks tapped his pen. And what about legality? You two aren't married. You don't have guardianship. You're a school teacher, and he's an ex-soldier with no official occupation. I run this ranch, Thomas said, his voice steady. I pay my taxes. I built the schoolhouse with my own hands, and I'm the man who rode into a snowstorm with nothing but a rifle to save that boy's life. Brooks opened his mouth to reply, But the door burst open first. Henry stood there, muddy boots, wild eyes. "Eliza," he gasped. "You gotta come quick. There's smoke. Back near the Pine Ridge." Rusty found it. Thomas was already grabbing his coat. "That's Harper's direction." Brooks stood too. "Who is Harper?" Thomas didn't look back. The reason that boy almost froze to death. The pines were thick, brittle, and blackened at the base by the time they arrived. Wind snapped through the needles, feeding flames that licked up a cluster of trees along the eastern ridge. The fire wasn't large yet, but it was spreading. "He's trying to flush us out," Thomas muttered, "or make us come to him." Eliza squinted into the smoke. "But why now?" "Because someone told him we've got the law on our side." They found Harper 20 minutes later, drunk, cornered, and half collapsed beside a smoldering tree stump. His eyes were bloodshot. His coat was torn. He pointed a pistol at Thomas with a trembling hand. "I want the boy," he slurred. "He was promised. He's mine." "No," Eliza said, stepping in front of Thomas. "He was never yours." "You think that badge-licking paper pusher's gonna keep him safe?" "That's funny." Harper spat. "That boy was currency. That was the deal." Thomas raised his rifle. "That deal's dead." Harper laughed. "So's everything else." Then he raised the gun, and a sharp crack echoed through the woods. The pistol flew from Harper's hand, his arm whipped sideways by the force of Thomas's shot. He screamed, fell to his knees, clutching his wrist. Brooks, pale as parchment, had arrived just in time to witness the whole thing. Thomas exhaled slowly, lowering the rifle. "We're done here." The fire was contained by nightfall. The town marshal came. Harper was taken into custody. Brooks, shaken, finally closed his folder and set it aside. In the soft light of the parlor, as Henry sat beside Eliza, brushing Rusty's ears and pretending not to listen, Brooks cleared his throat. "I misjudged things," he said carefully. "This isn't the usual case." "No," Eliza replied, her voice tired but firm. "It isn't." Brooks removed a single sheet of paper from his folder. "I can fast-track temporary guardianship. It'll buy time, enough to make it permanent, if you're willing to take that on." Eliza looked at Thomas, then at Henry. "Yes," she said, "we are." Brooks nodded, standing. "Then I'll leave you to it." As he stepped out into the cold, Thomas turned to her. "You sure about this?" She glanced toward the boy curled on the settee, half asleep, half smiling. "I was never more sure of anything in my life." And Thomas, a man who had once believed he'd lost the right to be needed, simply replied, "Me too." The morning came with the soft hush of falling snow and the comforting creak of old floorboards under stockinged feet. Henry stood by the window in Eliza's parlor, his breath fogging the glass as he traced shapes into the frost. Outside, Rusty chased shadows across the yard, yipping at flakes like they were enemies he had sworn to defeat. Behind him, Eliza stirred a pot of oatmeal and added a touch of cinnamon, Henry's favorite, though he never asked for it. She'd learned his likes in silence, the way he smoothed the edges of his napkin when he was nervous, or how he pressed one hand over his chest when he lied. She never called him on it. She just listened and waited. Thomas entered from the barn, shaking snow off his shoulders. "Cold one," he muttered. "Horses are restless, like they know something's coming." Eliza turned. "Bad weather?" Thomas shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe they just feel it. Change." Henry turned from the window. "Are they scared?" Thomas considered the question. "Not scared, just alert." Eliza watched the boy. His cheeks were fuller now. The hollows under his eyes had faded, the bruises mostly healed. But some wounds weren't skin deep, and today they were going back. Not to the Whitlow house. That was no longer standing, burned in the fire Harper started, whether by accident or spite. No, they were heading into town, to the schoolhouse, to face questions, whispers, and the uncertain kindness of neighbors who didn't know what to do with a boy like Henry. "You don't have to go if you're not ready," Eliza said gently. Henry turned back to the window. "I want to." She watched him for a moment. "Why?" He took a breath. "Because I want to know what it feels like, to come back and not be scared." The schoolhouse hadn't changed. The wood stove still clanked and groaned, and the bell still sounded too loud in the morning quiet. But when Eliza and Henry stepped inside, The room paused. Children turned, some blinked, a few whispered. Then Lucy Dobbins stood up. She walked to Henry and held out a cookie, a little smushed, wrapped in wax paper. "Mama said I should give you this. She said you'd like ginger." Henry didn't speak, just took the cookie, nodded. Then Jacob Miller said, "You gonna sit next to me today, or you want your old seat?" Henry hesitated. Can I sit by the window?" Jacob grinned. "Sure." Eliza blinked away the sting in her eyes. Maybe kids were wiser than adults gave them credit for. She watched Henry walk slowly to the second desk from the window, Rusty curling under it like he'd never left. And just like that, class began. That night, Thomas found Eliza on the back porch, arms wrapped around herself, gazing out at the stars. "You all right?" he asked, setting down 2 mugs. She took hers. "I should be. Henry smiled today. A real one. He laughed, answered questions. Rusty stole Lucy's sandwich, and no one even got mad." Thomas took a sip of coffee. "But," she stared at the sky, "but I keep wondering when the other shoe's going to drop, when someone from the state decides we're not enough, when Henry starts to believe he doesn't deserve this life." Thomas set his mug down. "He's not the only one who wonders that, Eliza." She looked at him. "I've made peace with a lot of things. The war, the loss, being alone. But you showed up like some impossible thing. You and that boy. And now I find myself hoping again that maybe I'm allowed to belong somewhere too." She reached out and took his hand. "You do," she said. He held her gaze. "Do I?" Eliza leaned forward, forehead resting gently against his. "This is home now, and we make the rules." Inside, Henry sat cross-legged on the rug, Rusty at his side, carefully building a house out of old dominoes. One wall tipped and fell. He stared at it for a moment, then slowly began again, this time bracing the corners. He didn't say a word, but he smiled, and that was how home began. Not with a grand gesture, but with ginger cookies, falling dominoes, and the quiet decision to stay. The envelope was heavier than it looked. Eliza turned it over in her hands for the 3rd time. The courthouse seal pressed into the wax like a final, silent judgment. It sat on the table between them, her, Thomas, and Henry, alongside a plate of cinnamon rolls Henry had helped bake that morning. His were misshapen. Too much sugar, not enough flour, but she'd eaten every bite. The boy stared at the envelope, then up at Eliza. "That's it?" She nodded. "That's it." Thomas leaned forward. "Want to open it together?" Henry's voice was small. "I want you to." Eliza glanced at Thomas. His eyes said everything. "You read it." So she did. Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal and unfolded the thick parchment. There were signatures, stamps, and legal phrases that didn't mean much on their own, but together they added up to something that meant everything. "This paper," she read, "confirms temporary guardianship of Henry Whitlow to Miss Eliza Ward and Mr. Thomas Callahan, jointly pending full adoption proceedings." She looked up. Henry's face was unreadable. He blinked once, then again. Then his lip quivered, and he dropped his head into her shoulder with a quiet, shuddering breath. "You're not going anywhere," she whispered, holding him tight. Thomas rose from his chair and placed a hand on the boy's back. "Not ever." For the first time since Henry had walked through their door, the house didn't feel like it was holding its breath. It felt like it had exhaled. Word spread quickly through town that Henry Whitlow, the boy who had vanished, come back broken, and been saved by the most unlikely pair, now had a home, not just in theory, on paper, in law. Miss Dobbins brought over a quilt she'd made. "Boys need softness too," she told Eliza with a wink. Reverend Charles offered to bless the family. "If that's your sort of thing," he added gently, and wasn't offended when they declined. At the general store, Mrs. Haskins tucked an extra jar of peach preserves into Eliza's basket and whispered, "For the boy." But not everyone was thrilled. A few townsfolk grumbled about appearances, about propriety, about a man and woman, unmarried, raising a child together on a ranch outside town. Thomas, upon hearing it, simply shrugged. They're welcome to lend a hand or hold their tongues. And Eliza, who used to care far too much about such whispers, found herself smiling, because at night she tucked a boy into bed, read him stories about wolves and wind and bravery, and knew he'd wake up safe. What could be more proper than that? Weeks passed. Winter began to loosen its grip. The thaw came slowly, first in the icicles shrinking along the eaves, then in the mud clinging to boots, and finally in the laughter echoing from the barn as Henry tried, and failed, to learn how to ride Rusty like a pony. Eliza watched from the porch, Thomas beside her, arms crossed and smiling. "He'll learn," she said. Thomas nodded. "He's stubborn enough." "Gets that from you." Thomas turned. "And the good parts?" She looked out at Henry. The way he patted Rusty's flank, the way he steadied himself after a fall, the way he grinned like hope was a new thing he could finally believe in. "All his," she said. There was a silence, the kind that stretched and settled. Then Thomas cleared his throat. "Judge Parker sent a letter." Eliza glanced over. "What kind of letter?" Thomas pulled a folded slip from his pocket and handed it to her. She scanned the opening lines, then froze. He watched her closely. "You said once that the paper didn't matter, that we already were a family. I meant it. But I was thinking," he added, voice quiet now, "maybe the paper could be a beginning instead of a formality." She read the final line again. "Petition to legally adopt Henry Whitlow as co-guardian and spouse. Both names. One home." Eliza looked up at him. Thomas didn't smile, didn't rush. He simply waited. "I don't need a dress," she said. He shrugged. "I don't need a preacher." She stepped forward, took his hand, and finally smiled. "But I wouldn't mind if the boy walked us down the aisle." Spring arrived in a scatter of blooms and new grass. The schoolhouse bell rang louder now, as if echoing the change. Henry took his seat near the window, Rusty curled beneath his feet, and no one whispered anymore. Not because they forgot, but because they understood. Sometimes the lost come home. Sometimes love doesn't ask permission. It just shows up, muddy boots and all. And sometimes family isn't about blood or history or the names on your birth certificate. Sometimes it starts with a knock on a door and a boy brave enough to answer it. And so, across these unforgiving lands, another tale drifts away with the wind. If this quiet courage, this stubborn heart touched you in any way, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and pass this story on to someone who needs it. Don't forget to subscribe, because out here there are still so many truths left to tell, each one carved from pain, hope, and dust. This is Wild West Stories. Thank you for watching.